Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Rick Landgraf, Managing Editor of the Texas National Security Review. Salami Tactics offer an attractive option for expansionist powers in the shadow of major war through the use of repetitive, limited Faits Accomplis to expand influence while sidestepping potential escalation. Despite its long history of use in policy discourse, however, the term has not received a thorough conceptualization. Richard Maass seeks to fill this gap. He highlights two case studies, 200 years apart, to illustrate a number of conditions under which policymakers may seek to use salami tactics. First, the U.S. annexation of Florida in the early 19th century, and second, Russia's interventions in Georgia and Crimea in 2008 and 2014, respectively. Deterring salami tactics poses unique challenges to U.S. foreign policy, which should work to ensure that the key escalation decision remains with potential aggressors, rather than being foisted onto defenders through faits accomplis. In light of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I sat down with Richard Maass to revisit his article from our winter 2021-2022 issue. I hope you enjoy the show. Okay, with me today is Richard Maass. He is an associate professor of political science at Old Dominion University and the coordinator of the U.S. Foreign Policy Concentration with the graduate program in international studies at ODU. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Today I want to talk about and revisit your article that appeared in the winter 2021-2022 issue of Texas National Security Review. The article's entitled Salami Tactics, Fait Accomplis, and the International Expansion in the Shadow of Major War. Richard, I want to ask you first if you could just outline your argument and kind of talk about the concept of what exactly salami tactics is.
The idea of salami tactics has been around for a long time. The basic kind of common sense notion is that it's a form of international expansion that does not rely on any kind of big knockout blows or winning a major war, but instead the actor would seek to expand slice by slice, like slicing salami. So you sometimes hear the term salami tactics or salami slicing strategies or various kinds of iterations on that phrasing. But the term goes back to at least the early 20th century. It was used during the Cold War by Thomas Schelling, among others, to talk about U.S.-Soviet competition. And basically the idea there was that in the shadow of potential nuclear war, that major war would be too potentially costly. Like the risks were just too great to try to expand through some major confrontation. And so the kinds of expansion that U.S. policymakers had to be worried about from the Soviet side would be smaller scale things that would be calculated to avoid escalation into a major war. And so this is really kind of where I settle on in defining the term as expansion that uses repetitive, limited faits accompli to expand influence while avoiding potential escalation. And so there's a few kind of conceptual elements to spin out there. One, I think about salami tactics as being useful within the context of an enduring rivalry. Right? It doesn't make much sense to treat a one-off case as salami tactics, but where you have a broader struggle for influence, then this might be an available strategy. Second, that salami tactics involve faits accompli. This is not a bargaining framework. It's not a back and forth or a coercive policy where you're trying to get the other side to do something. It's where you jump right out and grab something. You change the status quo in a way that then forces the adversary to react. So they can either basically take it or leave it, or try to contest it and reverse it. And that's often harder to do than trying to prevent something from happening in the first place. Third, those faits accompli have to be limited. So the logic of salami tactics is that you would try to expand through these limited slices that are calculated to avoid a major retaliation. Right? If you're doing something that you expect the other side to be really mad at and to hit you back in a major way, that's not really going to fit, this model. Instead, we're talking about things that the actors involved would calculate the other side would look at. They wouldn't be happy about it, but they also wouldn't be willing to pay major costs to try to reverse it. And that's kind of where the strategy gets its potential efficacy from, because if you can make gains, even if you're making the other side upset about them, if they're not upset enough to pay major costs to reverse it, then you still get to keep the gains that you've made. And so that brings us to the fourth conceptual element here, the prospect of repeat predation. Salami tactics, as a broader approach, rely on not just one slice, but the prospect that you could have a kind of step-by-step campaign of expansion where one little slice opens the door to a next one, and so on. And over time, you're making meaningful gains, even if there's no big, broad confrontation where you kind of declare victory. So the article really kind of digs into this concept and poses the question of when salami tactics are most likely to be appealing, and then what kinds of lessons we can draw as policymakers try to deter adversaries from pursuing them in the 21st century. So briefly, there are five major circumstances where the article finds salami tactics as likely to be appealing to policymakers. And it uses a game theoretic model to map these things out that's available in the appendix. But essentially what it boils down to is that policymakers are likely to see salami tactics as an appealing approach when first, retaliation would be costly. Right? If what you're doing is something that is going to be hard to retaliate against, is going to entail risks or costs to the adversary through their choice of retaliating, they'd be less likely to do that, and you'd be more likely to succeed. Second, if reversal is unlikely, whatever the initial fait accompli is, each slice that you're grabbing, if it's going to be really hard to just kind of de facto undo that. So think about occupying territory, right? It's hard to drive forces out of territory that they're already occupying, as opposed to, say, engaging in crisis diplomacy to try to prevent them from or deter them from occupying that territory in the first place. Third, the faits accompli are easy, right? If you can achieve some easy, quick gains, you'd be more likely to pursue them. Fourth, if the fears of future predation can be undercut, so if you have some opportunities, maybe given the broader strategic environment, to try to take steps that are going to paint this one slice as a standalone event and try to minimize the fears among either your main adversary or others in the broader strategic context, that this might be a real progressive kind of strategy that you try to frame your own ambitions as limited as opposed to systemic in scope, and hence try to undercut any kind of prospect of escalation on the other side. And finally, if further gains are possible, so the first slice, again, not being envisioned to be the last slice, and not necessarily that salami tactics require a broader kind of map of all the steps in advance. There's certainly room for opportunism here, right? You can make a small gain where you see an opportunity to do that, and just kind of being broadly cognizant that this might open the door to future gains. If that's playing a role in the decision making, I think we can meaningfully discuss salami tactics as being active here.
I want to talk a little bit about the two cases that you present in this piece, the case of U.S. expansionism into Florida, and then bring it up to kind of contemporary times, the cases of Russian expansionism, annexation of Crimea in 2014, and before that, aggression against Georgia in 2008. Starting with the Florida case, can you lay that out a bit for our audience?
Yeah, U.S. foreign policy history hasn't gotten all that much attention among IR scholars, and it's really a shame. Up until recently, there's been some really good work in the last decade or so, but there's a lot going on there. And one of the elements that I tease out in this article is the U.S. use of salami tactics against Spain in Florida. So most Americans go to school as a kid and learn about U.S. expansion and Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War and things like this. Florida ends up inevitably kind of being a footnote in all that. You don't really hear all that much about it, aside from that there was a treaty at some point and the U.S. got Florida from Spain. But if you dig into that historical story, it really was a multi-decade campaign of U.S. expansionism toward Spanish Florida. So right from after the revolution, the U.S. was not really focused on westward expansion all that much. In the Revolutionary War, the U.S. got Britain to cede the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River to the United States. But once it had that, the Mississippi River kind of formed a natural boundary, and there wasn't all that much kind of push to go beyond that. What mattered was control of the river, because lots of exports from the Ohio River Valley and so on went down the Mississippi and out to international markets. And so it became a big problem when Spain started cracking down on U.S. shipping there, banning U.S. shipping from warehouses, say, in New Orleans and things like this, taxing U.S. exports down the Mississippi River. So U.S. policymakers really wanted to have free shipping on the Mississippi, and if Spain wasn't willing to accommodate that, they really wanted to control New Orleans in order to control the river. And that expanded or included as well several other rivers that also led out into the Gulf of Mexico, which were also important outlets, although not as important as the Mississippi. So that desire to control New Orleans is ultimately what produces the Louisiana Purchase. And with Louisiana in hand, then what's next is those other rivers that are letting out into the Gulf through what's now Mississippi, Alabama, Florida Panhandle, and so on. And so after the Revolution, Spain controlled that whole Gulf Coast, including Florida itself. And U.S. leaders from Thomas Jefferson on targeted that as their next big area for territorial expansion. And they didn't want to fight a war with Spain over it. They kind of recognized that Spanish authority was very fragile in that area. And instead, what they did was try to change facts on the ground in ways that would culminate in an expansion of U.S. territory without requiring any kind of major escalation. At the time, they still pretty much thought of Spain as a European power. They didn't want to fight a war with Spain. And they didn't see it necessarily as worth fighting a war over if they could continue expanding without that. So what they did was a number of things, kind of sending individual agents down to foment rebellion, trying to enable U.S. forces that were operating in the area to cross over into Spanish territory without official kind of orders from the federal government, but many historians kind of see with kind of a behind-the-scenes approval, or at least not disapproval, by policymakers in Washington. And so you get individual cases like, say, in 1811, President Madison sends a guy named George Matthews down into East Florida, and Matthews gathers together 70 individuals from the state of Georgia and 9 from Florida who labeled themselves patriots and seized a border town called Fernandina in March of 1812. And so essentially, then President Madison turns around and disavows Matthews' actions, but he doesn't force him to leave. And especially as the War of 1812 is approaching and such, he basically says, well, okay, this is just evidence of the fact that Spanish authority in Florida is basically going bankrupt and it's disappearing. And the worst case of this was in 1818, where U.S. forces under Andrew Jackson went into Florida in pursuit officially of Native American threats along the border. But Jackson ends up seizing every remaining Spanish fort in Florida except for the capital of St. Augustine. And at that point, basically, President Monroe at the time decided that that would be a step too far. That would be essentially declaring war on Spain through his actions. So he recalls Jackson, but also rhetorically doubles down on the idea that essentially Spanish Florida is a failed state now. And so Spain doesn't really have any right to control it anymore. And Secretary of State John Quincy Adams pushes Spain very hard then in diplomatic negotiations to give Florida to the U.S. As Monroe said at the time, quote, to a country over which she fails to maintain her authority and which she permits to be converted to the annoyance of her neighbors, her jurisdiction for the time necessarily ceases to exist. Right? He comes out and openly says, essentially, Spain has no more jurisdiction over Florida. And so If not, then the U.S. is free to mess around and, pursue security measures as it sees fit. Spain can't really, say much about it if it can't provide order by itself. And so through all these kinds of more subtle measures, the U.S. Slices off little bits of Western Florida and pushes Spain to the table ultimately to cede all of Florida to the U.S. in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819.
Can you bring that up and draw parallels between that case and the case, the more recent case of Russia's actions against Georgia and Crimea?
Yeah, so the interesting parallels emerge there when you think about that period of U.S. foreign policy history in light of 200 years later, what we see Russia doing in Georgia and Ukraine. First in 2008, Russia essentially manipulates local self-defense forces in South Ossetia in Georgia to escalate their conflict there. There had been kind of a frozen conflict in place there since the collapse of the Soviet Union, with Russian peacekeepers involved, kind of extending Russia's influence over the situation and preventing Georgia from fully integrating South Ossetia into Georgia. And so in 2008, they kind of spark up the fighting there and manage to get the Georgian government to undertake an operation to try to ultimately defeat those South Ossetian separatists. And in response, Russia very quickly then crashes in and defeats Georgia's military and breaks away, not just South Ossetia, but also Abkhazia, another breakaway province in northwest Georgia. And so that war in 2008 between Russia and Georgia functioned as kind of a quick land grab by Russia in that context. But when seen in the broader scope of especially Russia-US competition for influence in Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the Cold War, this represents a case where Russia is not targeting NATO territory, it's not attacking US forces, it's deliberately kind of pursuing what was seen as peripheral kind of areas in that broader competition between the two, and trying to make a quick fait accompli. The whole war lasted a couple of days, and once Russian forces were in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the US was not going to send forces to drive them out. The US essentially didn't respond in that case. Helped to ship a few Georgian troops back from Iraq to help fight in the defense, but that was basically it. And so Russia takes the lesson from that it can get away with this sort of thing. And as the logic of Salami Tactics would suggest, in 2014 it takes another slice, this time in Ukraine. And there, even more so, we see echoes of some of the US behaviors in Florida, where Russia sends in unmarked military troops, disguising them as self-defense forces, the so-called little green men in Crimea, who seize key military facilities, government facilities, set up roadblocks and such, and undercut Ukraine's authority in Crimea. And once they're embedded there, once the fait accompli has been executed, then there's very little willingness on the part of the US or even Ukraine to escalate into a broader war. And so Russia essentially de facto gets away with that annexation. We see the immediate kind of continuation of that into the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And again, in the context of that broader rivalry for influence in Eastern Europe, certainly we have plenty of evidence that Russia's leaders conceived of their own geopolitical situation in that way, right? They saw themselves as kind of getting hemmed in by U.S. partners and allies, and trying to reestablish a sphere of influence or an imperial domain over territories that they saw as appropriately theirs, despite being neighboring sovereign states. So we see these kind of more subtle may not be the right word, but more limited faits accompli aimed at trying to extend Russian influence and undercut both U.S., European influence and the sovereignty of those neighboring states.
I understand this article was in our winter 2021 issue, and obviously based on your research and writing in the preceding months and years. So the important factor is that this appeared before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. With the benefit of hindsight, I guess two-part question here. Is there anything that you would change about the piece? And secondly, how should we understand, this escalation in the war of Russia's war against Ukraine? Is this a dramatic escalation in a Salami Tactics scenario, or is this something fundamentally different? So how does the 2022 invasion impact this analysis and the concept of Salami Tactics?
It's a great question, because in 2022, it really seems like Putin just kind of throws out the playbook, right? He had basically been behaving in this sort of way, kind of pursuing Salami Tactics through 2008, 2014, and so on, even up until 2021 in eastern Ukraine. But massing 100,000 troops all along a country's border and then sending them all in for a full-scale invasion is really kind of the opposite of Salami Tactics, right? So I think in terms of kind of if I was going to rewrite the article now, or what I would have done differently having seen that, it probably would just affect the framing overall, in terms of maybe the puzzle becomes, why does Putin abandon this playbook? Right? Why does he seem to be pursuing Salami Tactics up until 2022 and then decide we've had enough of that, we can go for the whole thing in Ukraine? I think a couple of lessons kind of spin out of that. On one hand, I think a lot of the work that was done around the time in February 2022 and after really pointed to Putin's expectation that invasion would be a quick success. He expected that Russian forces would be greeted much more positively by large segments of Ukraine's population, that they would quickly seize Kyiv and be able to establish control over most, if not all, the country. And that obviously didn't come to pass. He obviously dramatically underestimated Ukrainian nationalism and the will to defend their country. So in terms of why abandon Salami Tactics, probably a lot of it had to do with just that kind of calculation that maybe he judged that they were no longer necessary in that case. Maybe there was an element of kind of desperation there as he saw Ukraine turning more westward and kind of making progress toward joining the EU, more conversations about it, joining NATO and so on. But that actually points to some of the relevance of Salami Tactics in Russia's context, because one of the things that in retrospect pretty much everyone would agree on is that one of the things that characterized Ukraine in 2022 was that it was not a NATO member, right? That Russia didn't attack a NATO member, it attacked one of the other non-NATO member post-Soviet states. And the same applies to Georgia in 2008, right? So again, there's that element of, well, if you attack a NATO member, that pretty much is signaling that you're willing to risk escalation to major war. Attacking a non-NATO Eastern European country plays more into that broader Salami Tactics approach in terms of U.S.-Russian competition for influence in Eastern Europe. And this kind of speaks to the ultimate conclusion of the paper in terms of how U.S. policymakers should be thinking about deterring these things, right? Because nuclear weapons haven't gone anywhere. Major war is still devastatingly risky and costly. So if U.S. adversaries are looking at expanding, if they have expansionist ambitions, they're probably not going to be wanting to directly challenge the U.S. military, which means they are more likely to consider Salami Tactics as a strategy to pursue those expansionist ambitions. And so if the U.S. wants to deter them from doing that, whether it's further Russian aggression in Eastern Europe or China in the South China Sea, say, or other cases, then I think the paper holds a lot of value in terms of laying out those 5 conditions under which Salami Tactics are likely to be appealing, and pointing to 5 corresponding ways that policymakers might try to make them less appealing, right? To try to directly undercut the utility of Salami Tactics in the minds of the adversaries. And a key way that they can do that is to try to develop other forms of retaliation, lowering their own costs of retaliation. The key kind of trap that Salami Tactics set is by putting the decision to escalate in the hands of the defender. Because once you have achieved a fait accompli, then the defender has to decide, okay, are we willing to undertake offensive action to reverse that fait accompli? And that's an escalatory decision that's inevitably going to be costly, and that's going to pose a real dilemma for the defender. The more that policymakers can do to keep that escalatory decision in the hands of the aggressor, the more that kind of the logic of the situation is going to be making aggression harder and making defense and deterrence easier. And so there's a lot of things that policymakers can do on that score. Increasing the upfront costs of aggression is important. So not just tripwire forces, but meaningful contributions to territorial defense, especially in more vulnerable allied states, can play a major role. I think NATO has basically been doing that since 2016, even in Eastern Europe, and even more so since 2022. The mindset has been to really reinforce the defense of Eastern European NATO members and make it so that the promise of the alliance would not just be a post hoc intervention to revive the sovereignty of an invaded allied state, but active defense of its territory in the moment, preventing those kinds of faits accomplis from happening. And I think those really kind of are a lot of the crux of it, because it's changing the calculation of deterrence from a threat of post hoc punishment to an upfront deterrence by denial kind of approach, where aggression just becomes too costly in the mind of the adversary to make it worthwhile.
Richard Maass, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.